Karen had just moved into her first apartment in a quiet neighborhood. It was a cozy one-bedroom apartment with a small kitchen and living room, which she had lovingly decorated to feel like home. The house was nestled among tall trees, creating a serene atmosphere that Karen had come to appreciate. One evening, as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the living room, Karen sat on the couch, immersed in a book. She had recently moved into a new house and had not yet had time to get used to her new surroundings. The clock on the wall read 9:30, and she was looking forward to a quiet evening alone. Suddenly she heard a sound that made her heart race. The front door knob jiggled, as if someone had inserted a key, turned it, and then knocked. At first she thought her boyfriend had gotten home from work early and she couldn't wait to meet him. She put the book down on the coffee table and headed for the door with a smile. But as she got closer to the door, her excitement began to wane. She remembered that her boyfriend's work shift ended around 11 p.m., and it was too early for him to return. Peering through the peephole, she suspected something wrong, but all she could see was the hallway beyond the door, shrouded in a dim, mysterious light. Karen cautiously looked out the kitchen window, hoping to see her boyfriend's car in the parking lot. However, her heart dropped when she saw that his car was nowhere to be found. Anxiety increased and a shiver ran down her spine. Whoever was at the door, it wasn't the man she knew. As she pondered her next steps, the doorknob continued to turn and her pulse quickened. Panic gripped her as she realized this wasn't just a mistake or a friendly visit. Someone was trying to break into her apartment, and with force at that. The doorknob continued to move for a few more seconds and then stopped. A few minutes later, someone slipped some piece of metal between the door. Trying to open it, Karen retreated to the safety of the kitchen where, with trembling hands, she pulled a knife from a drawer. She clutched it tightly in her hands while fear and uncertainty raced through her mind. She knew she had to call for help. Such intense fear Karen had never felt in her life. With the phone in hand, she locked herself in the bathroom, crouching on the cold tile and holding the knife at the ready. Karen dialed 911 and, in a trembling voice, told of the terrible events unfolding in her apartment. The dispatcher assured her that the police were on their way and advised her to keep her head down until they arrived. Meanwhile, the intruder was getting more and more desperate to open the door. The minutes seemed like hours to Karen as she waited anxiously in the bathroom, adrenaline surging through her veins. Finally, the sounds outside stopped, and Karen's heart beat faster. She tensed, trying to hear any sign of intrusion, but heard nothing. Had the police been able to apprehend the intruder in time, or was the intruder already in her apartment? Minutes passed, and it was still as quiet behind the door. Soon the flashing lights of a police car illuminated the window. The police fussed about, scrutinizing the scene. The sense of relief that swept over Karen was immense. The police officers found an elderly man wandering around the apartment building with a knife and crowbar. He was clearly disoriented and had lived in the apartment before Karen moved in. He believed that Karen and her boyfriend had stolen his property, and his delusions drove him to such a desperate act as he tried to reclaim what he believed was rightfully his. This incident shook Karen to the core, and she couldn't help but think about what might have happened if she had opened the door thinking it was her boyfriend. The elderly man was taken into custody and received the care he needed. To this day, Karen's heart sinks when someone knocks on the door unexpectedly. The traumatic experience left an indelible mark, reminding her of the importance of caution and the unpredictability of the world around her. She learned to trust her instincts and prioritize her safety, which changed forever after that fateful evening in her first apartment. In a quiet neighborhood far from the bustling city, Lisa found herself home alone. Her husband was away on a business trip abroad, leaving her to fend for herself. The charming two-story house seemed to radiate tranquility in his absence. Lisa was glad for the opportunity to relax and enjoy the quiet solitude. One evening she decided to browse the latest news, a rare indulgence for her busy schedule. In the cozy living room, Lisa turned on the Samsung Smart TV, enjoying the modern conveniences. Placing the remote on the polished oak coffee table, she walked to the kitchen, intending to prepare a delicious dinner for herself. Gathering ingredients and creating her culinary masterpiece, Lisa noticed something unusual. The distant hum of the news anchor's voice was gone, and there was an awkward silence in the living room. It was unusual, but she attributed it to a technical problem, assuming that perhaps the signal had been interrupted or the TV had automatically shut off on a timer. Curiosity took over and Lisa decided to go over and take a look. She set the dishes aside and returned to the living room. Her heart ached as she looked at the television screen. The screen showed an image of the living room couch that sent shivers running down her spine. It was her living room with her couch. At first Lisa was puzzled by what she saw. Only after a minute did the gravity of the situation dawn on her. The camera built into the Samsung Smart TV had been activated and was broadcasting live video of her own living room. Panic surged through her veins. How was this possible? She was sure she hadn't touched the remote controls, and they still lay untouched on the coffee table. Her beloved Labrador Max was snoozing peacefully on the carpet, far away from the coffee table, so him accidentally pressing the buttons was out of the question. Lisa couldn't take her eyes off the creepy sight. It was as if an intruder had invaded the sanctuary of her home. She froze in place, her mind flickering with thoughts of who might be watching her through the lens of the television camera. Days passed, and Lisa still couldn't shake the feeling of violation and paranoia that had settled in her mind. She feared that her most intimate moments could be watched by an unknown sinister presence. She decided to take matters into her own hands and duct taped the camera on her smart TV, rendering it useless. But the thought that she was being watched still lingered like an unwelcome shadow. A few days later, the news broke, and Lisa's jaw dropped when she read the headline: Samsung Smart TVs vulnerable to hacking. The article reported the shocking revelation that some models of Samsung Smart TVs have security flaws that make them vulnerable to unauthorized access. Hackers apparently found a way to exploit these vulnerabilities and gain control of the TV's built-in camera. Lisa experienced the full range of negative emotions. Her worst fears had been confirmed. Her privacy had indeed been violated. She couldn't help but wonder how long this intrusion had gone unnoticed. Who was watching her and for what purpose? This thought kept her on her toes and made her feel unprotected and vulnerable. In the weeks that followed, Lisa immersed herself in a search for answers. She contacted Samsung, who assured her that they were actively working to address the security issues. She even hired a cybersecurity expert to check her devices and make sure her home network was secure. The expert found no signs of an ongoing intrusion, which reassured her somewhat. But the feeling of a breach persisted. Lisa's once tranquil abode had become a battleground of technology and paranoia. She was constantly checking locks, closing curtains, and questioning the privacy of her personal space. The mystery of how often she had been followed before duct tape her camera haunted her. She realized that in the digital age, privacy is a fragile concept, subject to both the convenience of modern technology and the threats of malicious hackers. In the midst of a cold Minnesota winter, the world outside the window was shrouded in a white veil. A thick blanket of snow covered the landscape, muffling even the faintest sounds. In a cozy house in a quiet suburban neighborhood sat a young man named Justin. His parents had gone to a local bar and his brother had gone to a friend's house. Justin was left alone, idly flipping through the channels of the television in the dimly lit living room. The house was silent, with only the occasional whisper of the wind outside the window and the muffled hum of the television. But then, in the midst of this loneliness, Justin's attention was distracted by a subtle, rhythmic tapping on the screen. At first it was faint, like someone tapping on a distant wall, but with each passing moment it grew louder and more insistent. Puzzled by this mysterious sound, Justin set the remote aside and stood up. He couldn't pinpoint where it was coming from, but it seemed to be coming from downstairs, from the basement. The house was old, with a basement that was always creepy, especially in the cold of winter. Curiosity got the best of Justin, and he decided to find out the source of the noise. He cautiously made his way down the creaky wooden stairs, catching his breath in the frosty air. The basement was dimly lit, and he couldn't make out anything. Boxes and forgotten items from years past were scattered everywhere and cast eerie shadows. He strained his hearing, but the mysterious knocking had stopped. Thinking he was imagining the whole thing, Justin turned to go back upstairs. As soon as he returned to the living room, as the silence was broken by a sound, it was a loud, unmistakable crack. followed by the distinct sound of the basement door swinging open. Justin's heart raced in his chest with fear. In a trembling voice, he shouted his brother's name, certain that he had returned without his knowledge. "Mike?" There was no answer, only the eerie echo of his own voice. He called again, louder, but the basement remained silent. Horrified, Justin hesitated for 5 minutes, not knowing what to do, but his gut told him that something was wrong. He walked slowly down the stairs, each step filled with fear. The sight he saw sent shivers down his spine. The basement was a mess. The drawers of old desks were open, their contents scattered on the floor. Cardboard boxes had been ripped open, their contents spilling out onto the floor. Several plastic cans and containers were lying around in disarray, some broken. The basement, once a place where secrets were kept, was now in chaos. But the most disturbing discovery was yet to come. Justin's gaze traveled to the rear glass door, and his heart dropped. It was open wide, and the cold winter air was pouring into the house. He hurriedly closed and locked it, his heart pounding with excitement. In a panic, Justin grabbed his phone and dialed his parents, who were still at the bar. His mother's voice shook as he explained the situation, and she quickly hung up to call the police. Meanwhile, the father decided to return home immediately. While waiting for his parents and the police to arrive, Justin couldn't escape the feeling that someone had invaded his hideout. Footprints outside the open door spoke of uninvited guests. When his father arrived, he examined the footprints and concluded that they led to the backyard, where the intruders had obviously climbed over the fence. It was a chilling discovery that threw everyone into deep confusion. The police soon arrived, but there was no further trace. There was no evidence, no witnesses, no way to determine whether this was a planned break-in or a random act. The horror of not knowing who had broken into their home and why haunted the family for months. The events of that fateful January evening left an indelible mark on Justin and his family. Their home, once a safe haven, was invaded, and the sense of security they felt was shattered. The unanswered mystery of that night continues to haunt them, leaving them wondering about the true motives of those who targeted their home. In the quiet suburban town of Cedarwood, where life seemed to flow at a relaxed pace, James was spending a quiet Saturday afternoon in his cozy living room. Next to him on the couch lay his faithful companion, a once timid rescue dog named Bella. James was the kind of person who liked to take a leisurely weekend, and this day was no exception. Around noon, he became engrossed in a slutty daytime TV show, something he wouldn't admit to his friends. Bella, abused and timid to the core, began to slowly come out of her shell after James adopted her. She went from a fearful shadow to an obedient, loving pet who rarely barked or showed aggression. As soon as the TV went silent, a sharp scream pierced the air, and James' heart raced. He looked down and saw that Bella's fur stood up, and her usually warm brown eyes were fixed with a tense, almost feral stare in the dark corner of the room. Her growl began as a low rumble, but quickly grew into a menacing snarl. The transformation was so abrupt and shocking that James couldn't understand its meaning. Bella, the epitome of timidity and gentleness, was now ready to pounce, baring her teeth and grinning predatorily. It seemed as if something otherworldly had gotten into her. "Bella, calm down," James whispered, trying to soothe her. He reached out a trembling hand to stroke her, but she recoiled as if in pain, continuing to stare intently into the corner. But the weirdness didn't end there. Just as James was trying to come to terms with Bella's sudden aggression, he heard footsteps coming from his neighbor's room at the far end of the hallway. His eyes darted to the source of the noise, and he couldn't believe what he saw. The hallway was empty. No one was there, but the footsteps continued to sound evenly, rhythmically, as if someone was walking toward him. James's heart raced, cold sweat beating on his forehead. His mind raced, searching for a rational explanation, but there was none. Bella was on high alert, her growls becoming more intense and her posture more defensive. Her tail, which until a few minutes ago had been wagging gently, was now trapped between her legs. The room was growing colder by the second, the temperature plummeting as if a gust of Arctic air had blown in. James felt his breath hitch in the cold air, and he was paralyzed with fear. Inexplicably, the curtains on the windows began to sway as if picked up by an invisible wind. Even though the windows were tightly closed, James' heart pounded in his chest as he stared at what was happening, unable to comprehend what was happening. It seemed as if an otherworldly presence had invaded the room, something unfathomable. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the cold dissipated, and the room returned to normal temperature. Bella, still shivering and tense, finally relaxed, though her eyes remained fixed on the dark corner. The inexplicable events threw James into a state of shock. In the days that followed, he couldn't shake the feeling that he and Bella had experienced something truly supernatural. There had never been any paranormal phenomena in this house or in his life.